Hi, everyone. I am here with a friend of mine, Bev Jo Von Dohre. She is a longtime veteran of lesbian separatism, and she is here to talk about her story. Maybe we'll just begin straight off the bat. Maybe just explain a background of who you are and how you came, well, how you came to the Bay Area and how you got involved in lesbian separatism.
Okay. Yeah, I was always in love with other girls from my earliest memories, so 3 years old. And my mother was very nice. I would tell her about whatever girl, like then when I went to kindergarten or grade school, she'd say, "You're in love with that girl." So I had a name for it. And I went to Catholic school for 8 years, and that was mixed.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned pretty quickly how nasty most of the boys were. And they were attacking the girls. And I mean, no matter how, even though it was very unacceptable, torturing animals, doing all kinds of stuff, attacking us as girls. And then I was 4 years in high school, two different high schools. And I grew up in Cincinnati. And then my parents moved us out here when I was 15. So I went 2 years to high school, another Catholic girls' school. And this was in Belmont, California. So from Cincinnati to out here, and I was always looking for others like me, and started to tell girls I was in love with them, and mostly got a reaction of like them avoiding even talking to me after that, but some stayed friends with me, and this was before it became so popular. Later, it became more popular. So then more of them were sort of playing around with being a lesbian. But I didn't change. I just continued. And I was always looking for other lesbians to be with and to have a community. And I was too young to go to the bars. I went to a couple of the bars, but at that point, I'm trying to think, I was like 18 and 19. And then in 1970, I found the lesbian feminist community that was in the Bay Area. I had gone to a Daughters of Politis meeting, but again, I was underage. I had to be 21. So I went there, and I met Martha, who became my second lover. But while just out of high school, I'd fallen in love with my best friend, Margaret. And we became lovers. But she was a year behind me in school, so she was really, and her parents were like, I would say, I don't know what word to use, she didn't have any freedom. I mean, they kept her like a prisoner pretty much. I mean, she didn't usually get to stay at other girls' houses. Like I would have slumber parties and my friends from high school would come, and she wasn't usually allowed to go anywhere. But it started to be I could stay over at her house, and she stayed over at mine once. Meanwhile, as soon as I got to be 16, I got my driver's license, and I had access to our family car, and I drove everywhere I could. So that really, still good. That really increased my life and my possibilities. So, but after a while, Margaret's mother and sisters were watching us. So somebody went through the letters I'd sent her. So we were forbidden to ever see each other again. And I mean, my letters to her were just like, "I love you. I can't wait to see you again. I'm so in love with you." But we had actually become lovers with no information. There were no books. There was nothing. And we just figured out what to do through our loving each other. And then when we continued to meet, a friend helped us write to each other. And my father told me all he had to do, because he was so embarrassed, was like, "You can't ever see each other again." But he didn't talk to me about it. And he said, "We're not going to tell your mother." Now, my mother, years later, when I told her what happened, she said, "If I'd known, I would have gone over and beat Margaret's mother up." Which I thought was very nice of my mother, considering she wouldn't have done that, but she would have defended me and defended me being with Margaret, which I think was really interesting. Yeah, and in many ways, I mean, she wasn't as supportive as she could have been. She would have liked me to be Hatton and reproduce, and I was the only kid, so they weren't going to get reproduction and grandchildren from anybody else. But I wasn't going to do that, so, but she was very supportive. My father just didn't really want to talk about it, and didn't know what to say. But what was odd was that actually my parents had begun to become very close with Margaret's parents, and would visit together, and it was in retrospect, it was quite interesting, because I think my parents were quite lonely living out here and being away from their families and everybody they knew. But anyway, so our friend Jean helped us write letters, and then we got found out again. And that point, in retrospect, why did Margaret let that happen? So she was going to go away to Davis to school, University of California. So I was at USF, which was a Catholic school, and I didn't know what that meant in terms of restriction, like not allowed to wear, you had to wear dresses to go to the dining hall and get fed. My first roommate, my second semester roommate, we got together because she was more of a feminist, and she was like the activist on the campus, and we stopped that rule. Like we kind of organized the two of us and got other girls to participate. So this was 1968 and to 69. I'm trying to think, is that right? Yeah.
And just to ask a
Yeah,
question about the
sure.
historical background. So it was
Sure.
my understanding that it was really the late 60s where like radical feminism was starting to take off.
I think so, but I wasn't around that. I think it might have been
Okay.
really different in New York City and some other
Okay,
places.
interesting. All
And I
right.
know there was a whole movement in Chicago. Out here, when I found the lesbian movement that was not age restricted, like not DOB, and DOB had seemed, Daughters of Elitis, quite old fashioned. Once we found like another organization, they were calling themselves Gay Women's Liberation, so they weren't saying lesbian yet.
Mhm.
And that was Judy Grahn, Wendy Cadden, Alice Malloy, and Carol Vovolatis.
Yeah, I was just curious about the Daughters of Bilitis or Bilitis. I'm not sure how
I
it's
always heard it as
pronounced.
Bilitis, but
Okay, interesting. There seems to be
Yeah.
discrepancy on that point. So
yeah,
they had a reputation for being more conservative about like,
yeah.
telling women to be feminine and that sort of
Well,
thing.
I
Is
think there
that
was some of that, but I'm not sure what all was going on because I was never a member.
Mhm.
And I did go to that meeting, and I mean, I think there were much more radicals in it. But the Gay Women's Liberation Group, well, for one thing, I would have had to wait till I was 21 to join.
Mhm.
So in that group, there was no age restriction, and they met at houses. So
Mhm.
we alternated between Judy and Wendy's apartment in San Francisco and Alice and Carol's rented house in Oakland. No, Berkeley at that point. So there were meetings like every week. And so I just started going, and then there were parties. And there would be dances at some of the group houses. So this is when the group houses began. And at this point, there were no books that I saw anywhere that was lesbian feminism.
Mhm.
In fact, some of the ones in our group started the Women's Press Collective. And again, that was Judy Grahn and Wendy Cadden. And I forget who all, Willis Kim. And they did the book Lesbians Speak Out that had photos and stories of different lesbians from the community. And it was interesting because, well, we'll get into that later, I guess, but there started to be dances and parties. So if there was a group house, and at this point, there were these huge old houses in Berkeley that had been like mansions, but were like pretty decrepit. But they could have like, I don't know, 10 bedrooms. So lesbians would be paying like $40, $50 a month rent to be in the house. And I was never in one that big, but I was in one that we paid like $50 for 3 bedrooms. But that meant there was space, like the living rooms alone meant you could have these enormous events. So there would be poetry readings and dances and other kinds of readings and just talks and meetings. And so that was before there was any actual recognized space that anybody was renting,
Mhm.
other than where everybody lived. So there were so many, and they were named for the streets they were in. So, yeah,
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
Were they mostly geared at that point towards like the arts and socializing? Was it not political,
It
really?
was very political,
Okay.
but not to the art stuff. It was much more working class was one thing too,
Okay.
and that changed. Like, I mean, it was like at that point there was criticism of anybody that was going to the university. I
Mm-hmm.
dropped out. I shouldn't have. That was stupid. It was free.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And some of
Interesting.
the ones who were saying we shouldn't do it because it's patriarchal, some of them had their degrees already. They were like a little bit older and they were from rich families and they were from other parts of the country. And they hid that. And then later they could go right back to it.
Oh.
So that was really an interesting thing. If I had any idea, I don't know what I would have done. I mean, I think I was at, I transferred, oh, the other thing with Margaret, I transferred to UC Davis to be with Margaret because that was her dream to go there. I didn't want to go there for any, I mean, it was horrifying to me to be that far away from home, no transportation, and just to be with her. And her parents found out. So she wasn't there and I was there. So I hitchhiked back pretty much every weekend to try and see her. And then it's a whole other issue. I got involved with my next lover, Martha, who really
Mm-hmm.
went after me, who was a bisexual. And that was horrific. But in some ways, it was good at least to be with her because she was supportive about women loving women. Um, so I'm really lucky. I survived the hitchhiking every week
Oh wow, that would.
from Davis, standing on the corner of University and 6th Street in Berkeley.
And this was in the late 60s.
Yeah, this was, I'm trying to think, 1968 to 69.
Mm-hmm. Was your bisexual lover, was she into politics or?
Well, at first she was very much like, she's got her girlfriend who she had been with in high school, but she had a boyfriend from when she was younger. So he was like a protection that her parents would like see that she was actually not a lesbian. She got caught too. They got caught.
Mm-hmm.
And she wasn't ever allowed to stay at anybody's house. Of course, once she was out here, she did whatever she wanted. So she was with him, but I don't think she liked it. And at least it was so weird because that was normal. That's what we were supposed to be. And I didn't want to have anything to do with it. But I remember one night that I had gone to visit her. I ended up sleeping on the floor in the same room as them, and her saying it hurt. And he was yet supposed to be such a nice, gentle man. Whatever they were doing, that was. And I was around friends in high school too that I would go visit, and we'd go to some. At that point, they were like hippie houses, and I was with one friend I spent the night with, and this man, boy, whatever, just looked at her and put his hand on her belly, and she just laid down and let him fuck her. And that was horrific. I mean, I'd never been around anything like that. I didn't even know what they were doing, but it was something to me that was really horrifying
Mm-hmm.
and disgusting. And it was like there's no love, there's no feeling involved. The women just do what the men want because they want to be considered normal. And I
Mm-hmm.
knew that girl, the one in high school, was in love with another girl. And there were a lot of the girls in love with other girls, but at a certain point, clearly, I was observing all this. They felt like they had to get boyfriends or they were going to be in trouble from their parents and the whole society. And I remember one of the girls who had been really close for years with another girl, and they were like really sweet together. And she said she then now this boyfriend, he got her to do dirty things. She didn't say what that was. I mean, I can imagine because it's all like that. To me, it's all horrible. Um, I mean, I know women have tried to change it and say it's great, but that's not what anybody thought then. And the women coming out who had been talked about how horrible it was being heterosexual, that they had felt like they had to do it to please their families, or then they had kids, they had to do it for that. But trying to think what else. But it was interesting. The high school was a Catholic school. There was some support for the girls to love other girls, which I'm guessing is some of it was from the nuns. It was very odd because there was like a school play, and two of the girls that really loved each other, they they didn't have a particular talent for the play, but they were showcased. They had gotten these pieces. This was very much the era. They'd gotten these pieces of seaweed that were coiled like trumpets, like old-fashioned kind of trumpets from other cultures, and they could blow on them to be like trumpets. And they were at the beginning of the school play, the two girls that were in love with each other that had been longtime friends, and they were kind of showcased as their special friendship.
Mm-hmm.
So there
Oh.
was more of that. Although, of course, for the school play they brought in boys from the boys' school. Um, but anyway, I'm rambling all over the place. So, but finding the other lesbians who then started talking about lesbian feminism, the politics of it really changed things. So it wasn't just we're hated, we find each other, we don't want to stop loving each other, we don't think the alternative is better at all. But there wasn't political awareness of oppression of women at that point, and then oppression of lesbians. But pretty soon, that was appearing, and so trying to think. I worked at the women's bookstore, Woman's Place, that was in Oakland, and then I found some other lesbians that wanted to be separatists, and we did the newspaper Dykes and Gorgons. That was in 1973. That was an all-separatist publication. We did one issue because we just wanted a political statement. If we put a date on it, we wouldn't have to pay taxes.
Oh.
So that was a way to just sort of get this out. And there was a lot of hostility from the lesbian community. It wasn't that radical, but it did talk about men destroying the earth and the crimes against women and other species. And I'm trying to think. Then I worked the collective with Amazon Quarterly. I was living in a group house later with Laurel and Gina, and I joined them. But then they became like enemies with me because there's one of the bars there weren't any lesbian bars that I knew of nearby, so we went to one of the gay bars. It's still around, the White Horse. And so, yeah, we would go on a particular night and try to make it be as lesbian as possible. And so Laura came in a very flouncy dress and flirted with the men. And it was like, that felt really like betrayal because we had nothing. So I got kicked out of that collective. I'm trying to think what else. There were lots of things I kept getting involved in, but then became too radical for.
Was it that like a lot of these groups, they didn't like your politics, or was it that they would, like you were saying, they would sometimes have like men try to flirt with men, or?
It was both.
Okay.
That went along with it, the politics and that, because we had opinions about it. But yet Amazon Quarterly did print and say some good things. Now I know backstories in a lot of these individuals in the publications that are not very nice, but that gets into a whole other issue because I know a lot of different history, and it's verified with friends and witnesses. But at that point, it felt important to have these things, and that was before there were actual books that I'm aware of that were lesbian feminist books. So it began to be newspapers, which were the cheapest way to produce something. And, there had been a local women's feminist newspaper in Berkeley that had lesbians involved in it. And suddenly there were newspapers all over the country, and some of them were much more radical than like the Bay Area. People always thought it was more radical, Berkeley, San Francisco, but it wasn't. The most radical newspaper I knew of was from Minneapolis, and that was the Lesbian Insider. And that was just wonderful. That was brilliant. People don't even know about it now. I've got back issues to a lot of these publications.
Interesting. Sorry. Why do you think it is that the more radical papers were not San Francisco Bay Area based?
It's so liberal here. I mean, there's a whole thing. It seemed like it was radical, but there's so much of like worshiping the male left and wanting to follow that, go in that direction, and emulate it. And it's just sort of like. I didn't know any lesbians that were working with gay men at all, but the first group called themselves Gay Women's Liberation as opposed to lesbian.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was like it was too scary, too much, too something. Yeah. Yeah. So I think New York was more radical. There were different things happening there, but all across the country too. Yeah, and just the fight to have women-only space that happened really early here. But we never had lesbian only that I'm aware of in an ongoing way, unless it was a particular closed group. But in Aotearoa, New Zealand, they had lesbian only space way early on. It was taken for granted. People here don't know that. Lesbians here don't tend to know that.
That's interesting. And didn't you lived in New Zealand?
Well, I stayed for 2 months one time, and then 1 month another time. I became lovers with a New Zealand lesbian separatist. And together, she and Linda Strega and I wrote Dykes and Gorgons. I'm sorry, Dykes Loving Dykes. I did Dykes and Gorgons with 2 other lesbians.
And what year was that when you wrote the book?
1990. but a
Okay.
lot of it we'd written in articles before. There was a publication called Lesbian Ethics, not the book. See, that's so strange to me because suddenly, in a community that was very wary of academics and people that got into power positions, suddenly the academics were worshipped. So one of the academics, who was a separatist, wrote a book that she titled the same name as this long-running lesbian, mostly separatist publication, which was Lesbian Ethics. I've never seen anybody criticize that, mention it, or say anything. To me, that's really wrong. That is really unethical.
Uh-huh.
And but yeah, I forget how often, but I've got every issue of the original journal, Lesbian Ethics. So that was a much more separatist publication. Although the one who did it, Jeanette Silvera, is pretty hostile to I and my separatist friends, even though she was a separatist. Then there were several gatherings that happened. I'm trying to think, was this the late 80s, early 90s, in the Midwest again? This was Wisconsin. There was like maybe 100 or more lesbian separatists went to these annual gatherings. And again, I don't see there being much history about that. There's a little bit. And some of the writers at the time went, but not all of them.
Interesting, because I mean, you hear a lot about like the Michigan Women's Festival,
yes,
as a big phenomenon, but
yes,
no, you don't hear about some of these other little
right,
groups, lesbian
right,
groups in
right.
the Midwest.
And a lot would go to Michigan. I mean, that was a wonderful thing. If it's closer, I would have gone every year. I went to sort of, well, there were events out here that were not on the same level that I went to. Robin Tyler did some. Robin Tyler's completely betrayed us, by the way. But Lisa Vogel did the Michigan Women's Music Festival, I think in the mid-70s. I went 3 times. And it was really hard physically. I was, by the time I was chronically sick, it was a nightmare. But it was really wonderful, and it was a way to meet friends I'd only been writing to and never met in person. But yeah, Michigan was amazing, and but very hard physically for those of us chronically sick. Yeah.
And Michigan Women's Festival that started in the late 70s?
Mid-70s, I think.
Mid-70s, okay.
The history will be somewhere. But yeah, I wanted to go from the beginning because it was on one piece of land, and then I think Lisa and I forget maybe others bought the piece that then it stayed on. And there's still stuff going on there now, but it's not the same. I mean, basically it got so attacked with men invading. And one of the men, I don't know if we want to get into this now, but one of the men who was outside, carrying weapons and saying they wanted to rape and kill us all, is the one who in Oakland murdered the white man who murdered the interracial lesbian couple.
Right,
and their son.
Yeah, the David Warfield, aka Dana Rivers. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now he's in a women's prison. And nobody hardly in the Bay Area knows about this at all. And they're always like, they never hurt anybody. They're so nice. They're just like, well, just the fact that they say they're women when they're not. And even worse, that they say they're lesbians when they're not. I mean, who does that?
Well, actually, we could segue into that topic about your early experiences with
of course, because then there's Elliot.
With trans-identified males in women's spaces.
Right, that's true. Because I was going into the lesbians that I met and knew. Yeah, when I was at the University of San Francisco, there was this man who wanted me to be with him, and I don't want to be unkind, but I found him really, really repulsive, and I felt sorry for him. This is what they do. I mean, almost everybody I know that's been supportive has felt sorry for them. He in no way wanted to be a woman or thought he was a woman. He didn't even know what a lesbian was. He wanted access to me, and then he started wanting access to other lesbians, and I'm like, I mean, I wouldn't have been with him if I was heterosexual, but the fact that I was in love with other women, because I believe it's a choice. And I've certainly, when certain lesbians get irate and they just start yelling that leads to political lesbianism. No, it doesn't. It's clearly a choice because all women could be lesbians, and I think innately would be if there wasn't for patriarchy. And so, but we're not supposed to say that now, and we're supposed to ignore the history of the countless women who were very heterosexual who came out at various points, and the countless women who were lesbians who went back when it suited them to get more privilege. I mean, and I could name names that just last a very long time of those who benefited by going back.
And just to clarify, what's the distinction between your stance and the political lesbian stance?
Well, in terms of political lesbians, I'm seeing a lot of insults being aimed at women who say they're political lesbians. My first experience, there was a woman that we thought of as older at the time. It's kind of ironical. She was in her 40s. She was working for the library, and she was a very strong feminist and very separatist in terms of not being around males. But she wasn't a lesbian, and she got a lot of support from lesbians in the community who really loved her. And she was very nice. And she did demonstrations, and she demonstrated at the Berkeley Library to have a little exhibit that was a feminist exhibit because they wouldn't let her have it. And she was arrested, and Linda was arrested with her and other friends. And at a certain point, she started to say she was a lesbian, I think to support us, but she wasn't in terms of living as a lesbian, being lovers with other women, or being fully fledged lesbian. Was more of an intellectual thing. But it was for her and some of the others, I think it was a statement of support. And I think there still is with some of the friends I have that live in other countries, or some are around here. They're not meaning it in any way to take away from anything that lesbians are doing or creating or culture. But I mean, I have a couple of friends that I don't think have ever been lovers with another woman that are saying they're lesbians. And I think of them in a different category. But I mean, I certainly trust them if they're never going to be with males again. I trust them more than the ones who say they're lesbians or with men. But anyway, but it's pretty enraging to be accused of being a political lesbian if you say we have a choice and we all choose it. Because that's what pretty much everybody in the 70s was saying, was a lesbian feminist. And later, years later, decades later, of course it's a choice. I mean, we could see it, like I say, we see it all around us with the women going back when they decide it's a little too hard and they're going to inherit from their families, or they're going to, I mean, I got to start listing the privilege. There is like a whole separate sub-community that I've noticed here. I went to a very expensive music event, the friend paid, and I went with a friend who's African descent, and we were both horrified that the audience was almost all European descent and very class privileged. And it's like, except for the performers, where are the African descent women or lesbians? And we didn't know who any of these women were, but they were all clearly seeming like lesbians. We later figured out not only were they European descent and getting race privilege, but they were very class privileged. They had their own sub-community. And a lot of them had been married, and they inherited money from, or they got money from their husbands, their divorces, their careers, whatever. And they're in a whole other category. They don't want to be around lesbians like us. And I kind of knew there were some like that. And years ago, there was like a potlucks that would happen in certain neighborhoods in Oakland. And they would want people to go who only lived in those neighborhoods that were the richer neighborhoods. And that was a shock. That was completely against lesbian feminist politics and principles. But this thing at this music event, I was like, who are they and where the hell did they come from? But they go to events that they can afford that others can't. So that's going on all the time. There's things we don't even know about that are like that. And of course, a real lesbian community that is welcoming, lesbians of all classes and all races are welcome and appreciated. And but there used to be much more of a sense of it being welcoming instead of what I see is the kind of segregation that happens here with what used to be the museums and botanical gardens. They're all segregated now. None of this used to be, and the lesbian community didn't used to be. So, I mean, I know they're separate, and yet there's an acceptance of that now. We're segregating based on class, which also means race, disability, and everything. Where are we? I was going to talk about meeting that man who was pressuring me to be with him, which his name was Elliot Matuzzi. And I make friends quickly. I've had to because I grew up being an only kid. And I had already made some friends at USF, these other women, and sort of invited him to join us hanging out wherever we hung out, the dining hall or whatever. And he just kept sort of glomming on to me. And then at a certain point, I'm not sure, months, year, 2 years, he decided he was a lesbian, or he wanted to be a lesbian, which that was nothing innate about him at all. And he lies like crazy now. If you see anything he's printed, he makes up that he asked his parents when he was 12 for some kind of sex reassignment. That's all a lie. He was just a regular boy who'd gone to a Catholic boys' school, a seminary school, and maybe would have even been a priest. But he got obsessed with lesbians, and unfortunately, I was the lesbian he met. I don't think he would have, if he'd found some woman he wanted to be with, he wouldn't have gone in this direction at all. I don't think. But anyway, there's no getting away from him. I mean, I feel like I ignore it, but I'm in physical danger because stalkers can attack and kill you at any time. He's been stalking me since I was 17. And the last event I was at, that was a lesbian event where he was. We had name tags to wear, and he put my name on his name tag and sat down between two of my closest friends at that event. And being class privileged, they didn't say a word. They just were like, la la, nothing's happening. And he's just sort of smirking, waiting for me to either say something or not say something. Mm-hmm. He's friends with friends of mine on Facebook, and he occasionally will make some kind of prurient or kind of lurid, nasty comment the way males do, hoping I'll respond and maybe I'll lose that friend. And I used to interact and respond. I don't now. But he's like watching me through the friends, and he lives in our same area. I'm trying to think what else. Oh, the most terrible thing to me was recently he has access to publications I don't. So Sinister Wisdom used to be a lesbian kind of artsy journal from the 70s, I think. And I never liked it particularly, although there were some good political things in it. So it's now being done by Julie Enzer, who is like making it be for the men who say they're lesbians, really showcasing them. And in it was printed one of the worst of those men who does an interview with Elliot where he slanders me and I'm not allowed to respond. Mm. And I've written to Julie Enzer and like, he's slandering me. I have a whole rebuttal, which others have printed. I'm trying to think. Eva Kurilova printed, right. Yeah. Which I really appreciate. I didn't know her at all. She's in Canada, originally from Slovakia. She's wonderful, and I so appreciate her because she just, we worked together. She was as nice as could be. Printed photos, printed my statement. I sent it to Julie Enzer. It's not going to get printed. In this interview, he basically says he and I were intimate. He says one of the complaints was I didn't want to have as much sex with him as he wanted. I didn't ever have anything with him. There was not even a kiss. I never even held hands with the fucker. I mean, he's just a prick. I had no intimate contact at all with him. I hung around him like I hung around my women friends because I felt sorry for him. And just to warn everybody else, it's a really big mistake. Don't do it. If you feel sorry for those men, they can always find other women who will take care of them because men always can. Women will do anything for men, most women. It's really, and certainly lesbians shouldn't and don't need to. And they're not more oppressed than us. And I think it's really interesting that when Rachel Dolezal was pulling a similar thing as a European descent woman who was passing herself off as African descent and got in a power position with a job with, what was the job? Do you remember? It was one of the major...
Oh, for the NAACP?
Yeah, major black organization. She gets this fancy job. Her parents went public that she's not African descent at all. Mm-hmm. And I think she'd adopted some kids. I don't know what all she did. And the African American community, as far as I know, everybody cut her off. Right. There are some white feminists who are like, oh, maybe she meant well. Well, if you look at her history, I said to one of them, I'm like, she went to Howard University and sued Howard University for discriminating against her as a white woman. Mm. And that's documented. So there she is And there was a speaking of there's a documentary about her I watched with a friend who was hoping it was going to have a happy ending. She says, let's wait because maybe she'll be good. She'll be all right. And she goes at the end and she changes her name to sound African.
Mm-hmm.
So she's no longer Rachel Dolezal. I have no idea. I cannot remember the name. I'd have to have it written down. It's not her name. She's not African. She's not African descent. But the difference between the African American community and I would say African descent, because it's not just from this country, is they say no to people like that.
Mm-hmm.
You're a fraud. You're harming us. You're using us. You're using our culture. And they're just like, get away. And yet, and I see a higher percentage of African descent lesbians saying no to the men who say they're lesbians than I do with the European descent lesbians. But that's what we need in our community is they're not, how can they possibly be lesbians? I mean, even women, they're not women. I mean, is that all we are? We're just castrated men. But by the way, just to let everybody know, most of them do not get castrated. Most of them do not do that. Because I know some who say they go through so much hardship and hell and they have, surgery and they have hormones. Well, no, they don't. They wouldn't be able to rape if they did. Most of them don't.
So yeah, it's true. Most don't go through the whole surgery. Yeah. I'm just curious. Did you have any other early experiences back either in the 70s or 80s with trans-identified males in women or lesbian spaces?
I have to think about it. Because he persisted. Oh, he got into DOB. He got Elliot, the Tutsi, who calls himself Beth Elliot. By the way, he picked a name I feel like as close to mine as he could, Beth. And he dyed his hair a similar color to the red my hair was then. And he still does. And anyway, he got into DOB and he was made vice president. He got into somewhat of a power position. And what I've heard is there was a big fight. The organization ended over him. And it doesn't exist anymore. So he was part of that.
Interesting. Okay. The San Francisco chapter of DOB. Okay.
And he did other stuff too. One of the better feminist publications that had a lot of lesbian content was, and I'm going blank on it, Off Our Backs. He wrote an article about lesbian sex, and he lied to them and told them he was a woman-born woman. Because when I saw it, at that point, I felt pretty hopeless about fighting it, but I called up, and I think, I don't remember which one I talked with, and they were horrified that he lied to them. So the whole article is about lesbian sex, but it was printed because they believed he was actually a lesbian. So a lot of them do that. But I'm trying to think what else. He's just continued. The other thing is, he says he's a lesbian, but he also is bisexual. So identifies as bisexual. So, and he's also a sadomasochist. So he's very proud that he was Ms. Leather of Alameda County. And somebody I know said there was only one contestant. That was him. So that's kind of on his resume. I know.
Gosh. Wow.
He's well, I would say he's a narcissist, but he's a psychopath. He's dangerous. I don't worry about it, but I don't feel safe that he's running around. And he's increased the slander actually with that issue of Sinister Wisdom. I mean, that had been a lesbian publication. Now the trannies are running it. With Julians are helping. I'm trying to think what else with the other ones. I have to think about it. It's weird because I'll be in a thread with a friend, and there'll be one of them. They're like the one who was with Olivia Records, I think.
Oh yeah, that was mentioned in Janice Raymond's Transsexual Empire. Yeah. That case. Yeah.
And he's still mad and bitter. Whatever. He knew who I was, so he went after me to slander me in this thread on Facebook, and I'd never met him.
Interesting.
So yeah, but I have to think about if there are others I've had run-ins with. It's so funny in the media because I can just recognize them. Whatever these shows are that they're like pretending not to be, they're very visible in terms of on many levels. No matter how much plastic surgery, whether it's their voices or
Mm-hmm.
What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to ask how big of a controversy was that whole issue of trans inclusion way back when, or when do you remember it really exploding as an issue? Or
recent, actually, because I think for the most part, lesbians didn't want to have anything to do with it. They didn't like it.
Mm-hmm.
They had some supporters, but I'm trying to think. It was I went to a neighborhood potluck, would have been after 98. So I'm not sure how long after 98, maybe year 2000. And Elliot was there, and it was supposed to be a lesbian potluck. So I went up to the lesbian running it, and I tried to talk to her, and she said, well, she is more welcome here than you are. She didn't know me. But I and my lover left because the tide had turned in terms of they were getting more and more support. But it was massively changed than what it was before, because mostly they were ignored and not welcome at all. It's my understanding. So that was 10, 20 years, and now it just began to get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, so late 90s was when the cracks were starting to show. Okay, I think when did Camp Trans begin?
Good point.
I know there was a big increase in trans identification in the late 90s. That was actually around the time that the Dana Warfield, Dana Rivers transitioned and became an activist. So I feel like there was something that changed then.
I'm not definitely that had an effect, but I would think that would have made more lesbians hate them. But I think there was enough pressure that some got into Michigan. And I've heard they would be in a workshop and they'd start talking about their penises, and they'd run around naked in front of little girls in the showers. And I mean, it was pretty bad. But some of them did get in, although they're really visible. I don't know exactly what happened. I wasn't there when there were any that I was aware of. Because it was like thousands. When I was there one year, it was like 7,000, mostly lesbians, and no visible men. So that camp started happening where they were walking around with weapons, with tattoos saying Dice is scum, and having machetes and spears, and there's photos of that. And then in San Francisco, the library in 2018, I think, after the murders, had an exhibit showing weapons to kill us with. So it was weapons to kill TERFs with. So this is the San Francisco main library with so-called bloody shirts. One wearing a shirt saying "I punch TERFs," and bats with barbed wire, and just weapons that could kill women. It wouldn't even have to be lesbian, just anybody says no to these men. So that was an exhibit that went on for 2 months, and they wouldn't have done that about any other group. They wouldn't have allowed that. So some of us called, some of us wrote. I think they took one thing down, but the rest was there. And that was the year, I think, of the Dyke March, unless I'm getting the years confused, where lesbians marched en masse in support of the trans, and were threatening and yelling at anybody that had. There were 2 lesbians that had signs talking about children being given hormones, and they were physically attacked. One of them had a cane, and they attacked her anyway, knocked her down, tore up the signs.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you don't remember what year that was?
I think it was 2018, the same year as the exhibit. And I think that might have been the last Dyke March that was a lot of lesbians. Because I think if it wasn't 2018, it was 2016. But I think it was 2018. I should have the info at home. But then the next year, I think it seemed to be clearly they were in charge, men were in charge. And I had contacted them, and there had been this massive increase of heterosexual couples, saying they were queer. And so there'd be like, how they would, in the contingents, they'd go and they'd stop at a particular block and wait for others to catch up, and they'd move on. And sometimes in a block where it was full of people, they'd all be heterosexual couples, clearly together. And, so it was a trendy event for them. And then there were more and more aggressive het men. So when I called up and talked to somebody with the Dyke March who was clearly a man or a tranny, he said, Oh, so yeah, we want to keep the heterosexual men out, the cis men. But clearly, he wasn't considered a man, this one, and the rest of them.
Yeah.
And cis, of course, is a slur that nobody who cares about girls or women or is in the right mind should use. It's just a slur. And I think it's got a pretty bad history, too. So anyway, they took over the Dyke March. They already had the Gay March. I mean, they already took that over. I mean, the one thing that did change is there was the NAMBLA contingent, and that stopped. But I wouldn't be surprised if that comes back. That was the huge banners, and the the gay marches. The parades. They would have I don't know what you call them. They're motorized, so all these people on a platform that's motorized, and it was the North American Man-Boy Love Association. So there was a lot of combining for the men. Pedophilia, porn, child rape, sadomasochism, and then trans stuff. It was all combined, intertwined. And that was very, very open. But they got NAMBLA's banner hidden at some point, I guess, because it was making really bad publicity. But I can...
sorry. I was just gonna ask that. That's another thing that I know you talked about. We have a long history of talking about is the sadomasochism element in the Bay Area.
Yes.
With it's sort of the intersection with lesbian culture in some cases.
Yeah. Which that was, I feel like it was, it's interesting. The 3 so-called lesbian sex books were put out in the Bay Area, were put out by bisexual women. One of whom admits to be, that's Susie Bright. Wait a minute, am I getting her? Oh, and the other 2, Joy and Lulin, was pretending to be a lesbian for years during workshops at Michigan, saying some lesbians have wonderful ongoing sexual relationships with men. And finally, she was on a major TV show where she and her boyfriend publicly admitted they were heterosexual together. And her book was full of sadomasochism and porn, as was her workshop. So she did a lot of influence. Pat Cliffy was the other one, but she's the main one, I think, who started, and she's very intertwined with the trans thing, because she's now saying she's Patrick, right.
And she's a bisexual man. That's how she identifies now.
Who's with another bisexual man, and they're both women.
Okay.
And then people muddy this with saying she was butch, they're butch. No. And Lauren Cameron did a book called Body Alchemy that was about women saying they're men. And again, people always think they're talking about the trans men or butch. And I carefully looked through the book. Not one of them was butch. They were all femme. But, they're doing the posing. And so at Califia's, well, they started with workshops. And then they had a pamphlet, like a booklet. And then they had a book. But the beginning group was called Samoa. That was taken from one of the sadomasochists. I forget names, and some other, I don't know, one of those French books way back that was popular last century, previous century. I guess we're going back into the 1800s, early 1900s. I don't even know. But anyway, Samoa, they had that as the name of their women's so-called lesbian sadomasochist group. And Califia really brought that stuff in with Gail Rubin and really normalized porn and sadomasochism. Her book, Macho Sluts, which some local lesbians who were stars, kept hidden that they were followers of her, but had her badge or button, as they say. We say in the U.S., but hid it, so it wasn't really public. In that book, she has, one of her chapters is a lesbian being gang raped by what are supposed to be gay men dressed as cops, and it's supposed to be really exciting and just really wonderful. I was in a bookstore, so it's like, here's this book, it's new, it's by her, called Macho Sluts. I pick it up, I go right to that chapter, I'm looking at it, and from what I can tell, I skim it, I don't get the book. It's not clear whether the victim knows it's her birthday present, that she's gang raped by a bunch of men dressed as cops. After they finish with her, they give her their semen-filled condoms as part of the gift. I mean, every part of it is disgusting. And this is a book she's had out for years, and she still has followers and is popular. But that's the kind of thing that gets men looking at that stuff thinking, oh, lesbians want to be raped.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, like I say, I skimmed it. I don't have it to look at to double check. I don't remember being clear whether it was an actual rape or the victim was in on it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. And meanwhile, after she decides she's a man, she's still the advice columnist, the sex advice columnist for lesbians in Girlfriends magazine. Pat Cliff,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
I think that there's like this is sort of a source of a lot of misunderstanding that a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people are talking about butches as being sort of conflating the issue with butches with the
Right.
sadomasochism thing. Which
Sheila Jeffreys does that.
Yeah.
She's just lesbian hating on incredible levels.
Well, do you
But
want to
yeah,
set the record straight on Sheila
yeah.
Jeffreys?
Oh, that'll be a while. Yeah. 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 First, I want to say though that
Okay.
being butch has nothing to do with sadomasochism or trans or anything like that. So Sheila Jeffreys, I met her in the late 80s. She visited Linda, Rustin, and I at the house Linda and I were renting in Oakland. And I say this because she later referred to visiting me at my house, which I never had a house, and it didn't happen. She just keeps changing the story. And then more recently, she said she visited with us. Because when I am in any thread that I see this, and of course she's writing under pseudonym, and I don't know if I should say the pseudonym, but I think everybody should know it if she's writing using my name. But one of the last things was that she met us at a restaurant in San Francisco. That never happened. We never met her at a restaurant. Never went to San Francisco with her. She came to the house. We spent like 3 hours, maybe more. And she was really traumatized because she'd written and published, I guess, The Spinster and Her Enemies, which I remember it being a sort of radical feminist book. I don't know how radical, I don't know how lesbian,
Mm-hmm.
not an impressive title. I think that was her first book. And she had been against sadomasochism, and she really, really got harassed, bullied, and attacked in London. And she talked about that with us. And we spent like over 3 hours just comforting her, supporting her, being outraged on her behalf, agreeing with her completely. And then we get near the end of what we probably should go home. She should go home where she's staying, and we should stop. And Melinda and I are chronically sick, so it was like pretty grueling for us too. And Sheila brings up wanting to talk about butch and femme. And this is where there's certain lesbians who you can sense they've got lesbian hating in them. And so we just kind of looked at each other like, oh no, 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 this is going to go bad. And we tried not to talk about it, and she pushed. So we basically got out maybe a sentence that, well, for us, it's not role playing. We're adamantly against role playing as butch and femme, adamantly. But we believe that from an early age, some girls grow up being butch, and some are more obedient to what the rules are to be feminine. We don't think being feminine is more natural at all to girls. I mean, if girls are let to be their wild selves, I don't think any would be flouncing around in dresses and wearing their mother's high heels or whatever I saw girls do. Actually, I didn't see that so much growing up, but in the lesbian community, some of the daughters of lesbians who had been het did that, like wearing high heels. But anyway, so we just got out like a sentence or two that we feel like this is a choice made in girlhood. She flipped. She wouldn't look us in the eye. It reminded me of a couple of times in high school when I told girls I thought I might be a lesbian. She just was like, I'm leaving. She started to call a cab. She was staying in Berkeley. I said, I'll drive you. I thought if we talk on the way back, she might like stop what she's doing because she was like acting nuts. And I didn't want to give up on that. We had this starting friendship, which was with someone who seemed to be a radical lesbian separatist or feminist, but maybe separatist. And Rustin just said, let her go. And Linda's like, don't even do it. I drove her all the way back. She wouldn't speak to me. She wouldn't look at me. And she's been lying about the three of us ever since, but targeting targeting me in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of interesting. Why targeting me? Linda and Rustin co-wrote our book and are very much part of it. And our politics, Linda and mine, are the same on that issue. Rustin has changed, but I don't know how much. That's a whole other issue. But I think she would agree about what we wrote about, what it means to be butch and femme. So since then, Sheila Jeffreys has been taking every hit she can, and I don't know what most of it is. So more recently with the WDI, with Lauren Levy, there's a video they do where I'm not invited to participate at all, even though I'm named, where, and I want a back history of Lauren. I've never met her, but we had talked on the phone a few years ago, trying to be friends, and I sent her the link to my blogs, which included our book, most of our book, and on the phone she said, "You sound intelligent, but you say you're working class." And if she's a lesbian feminist, well, she's not, obviously. I don't know how somebody could be in the lesbian community for any length of time and have those kinds of politics. So that was like, what? So, and then Sheila, in the interview, so that's a past about Lauren. And I've written about it elsewhere about this is what she did. She's never apologized, never contacted me. So the two of them basically, I didn't watch the whole video. A friend in Ireland sent it, who's also a lesbian separatist, who's butch, who said, they're saying this about you. And just to let you know, there's a lot of lesbians that really hate them both, and really hate Sheila Jeffreys because she's so lesbian hating. And that was what I picked up from her when she visited and flipped out. She's lesbian hating. All this stuff brings up her lesbian hatred. And I've heard that she's a political lesbian.
Yeah.
So I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
What does that mean? But anyway, what they did in this is to go back to the 70s, we didn't have a way to find out what was happening in the community. There was a paper that was a lesbian and gay paper called the Bay Times. It was free, that had upcoming events. It was full of gay male porn ads. It was just disgusting. So there's like an image like from that era of a gay man, a drawing that's a sadomasochist. And these porn ads were full of sadomasochists and sadomasochistic stuff and leather party listings and all that crap. So they put that image in their the video and refer to me as a butch, that this is what butches are. Mm-hmm. I've been fighting it all these years, plus fighting sadomasochism. And I gotta say, if she's been heterosexual, to me that's sadomasochism. So there are levels that can be played at. Mm-hmm. You can pretend it's all love and nice. But to me, from what I've figured out, I haven't done it, but there's humiliation involved, there's pain involved, there's role-playing, there's all kinds of crap. Being butch or femme does not mean role-playing at all. It's kind of like saying, yeah, I grew up with class privilege, or I grew up class oppressed. You grew up with a culture, various different cultures that we grew up with. And being butch is more on the spectrum of getting lesbian oppression from an early age, where butches are more likely to have been locked up in mental hospitals. I wasn't. Treated horribly by their families, disowned, they become runaways. Alice Mag, who did Gender Trender, that was the best anti-trans, what do you call it? Not a publication. It was on WordPress. It was posting videos regularly. Mm-hmm. Brilliant, way before anybody else that I know did that. She was a 14-year-old runaway. Mm-hmm. Very poor background. But anyway, Jeffreys, so, okay, political lesbian, well, that explains a lot. Why is she talking about us then? But anyway, this thing was such a horrible slander, and I wasn't allowed to respond. Mm-hmm. I kept trying to answer in the video.
And the comments
they wouldn't
stick.
Allow
they
it.
Were taken down or something.
They wouldn't allow it.
Yeah.
And I know others that really hate her. I mean, I guess I do too at this point, but why won't she talk with us? Like, what is going on with her? To me, that's lesbian hatred. You just target a group of lesbians, you slander them in the worst way you possibly can, and because she's got so much privilege and the power of the press, can't answer. The other thing is, I glance at some of her later books. I don't want to buy her books. From what I could tell, and this was after our book had come out, she plagiarizes us. Mm-hmm. And if I could look at some of her books, I could probably say, oh, and then look at our book and say this is right where she plagiarizes us, but she does, and I think she still does, and a lot do, and they don't give us any credit for what they've taken, and that's class too. But I mean, Rustin's middle class, but Linda and I are not. So to me, that's really kind of, I've just seen so much of that, but
yeah.
So, but anyway, what to do about Jeffreys? She's got massive power.
Yeah, no, I think she and Julie Bindel or Bindel, I don't know how it's pronounced, seem to be the most famous of the political lesbians.
Is Bindel considered a political lesbian? Because that's interesting. Before our book went into print, there were two lesbians in England who did a publication called Lesbian International, and they printed the first, or maybe first two chapters of our book, and Bindel in another publication completely ridiculed it. I don't remember that she answered anything we said, but she did cartoons making fun of us, and which really upset Rustin in particular, because English lesbians have a power over lesbians from New Zealand that's powerful. I mean, it has an effect in making fun of anybody and how they look. She'd never seen any of us, but that was nasty. I have it somewhere. But Bindel, you know, it's aggravating. If you go to Wikipedia, the last I'd seen, this was a couple years, she's the only lesbian feminist listed. So, and how you get anybody else on there, I don't know. But yeah, she's not a nice person either. So to me, she's very lesbian hating. Like, what is she objecting to in the beginning of our book? We talk about crimes men commit against girls and women and the earth, what's destroying the environment. And we talk about basic issues of separatism, why it's important for females to separate. But yeah, that was weird. She just immediately went after us to destroy us. But then we published our book, but it doesn't get around in the same way as books that are put out by mainstream publishers. For a while it was around. It was in some of the libraries, but nobody knows about it now. So it would be great if somebody took it on to republish. We have an updated version. A friend helped me do that was about 25 years later, but it's pretty close to the original. I think what we did was amazing. I think it's really, really accurate. But so Bindel, yeah, okay. So do they get along, I wonder? You would think they wouldn't.
You mean Jeffreys and Bindel?
Because narcissists don't usually.
I honestly don't.
They usually don't.
I don't know, yeah. But, yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, you know so many different personalities, or at least have some exposure to all these
I know.
big names. Are there any, like, I mean, you've mentioned Linda and Rustin, but are there any other sort of lesbian separatists or lesbian feminists who you think you wish more people knew of?
In terms of now, I'd have to think about, in terms of the past, I think Julie Penelope did some of the best books that were for and about lesbians. And she was a working class butch who got into academia, and she co-authored some of the books with one she did, Finding the Lesbians, with her lover at the time. I'm trying to think of her name. Her last name is Valentine. And another she did with Susan Wolfe. And I've got the books. They're really good. And she did, with Sarah Hoagland, who's another issue. But
was Sarah Hoagland the one that did Lesbian Ethics?
Yeah.
Okay. The book, Lesbian Ethics.
Which stole the title.
Right. Yeah.
And also, she sent me the original manuscript to edit or check it out. We're not really friends. She's like really, to me, very privileged. And it was horrifying to me. I mean, I was like, don't go into print with this. It will feed so much anti-separatism in terms of the things she was saying. Not that she was deliberately saying or doing anything, but it was really bad. And she didn't. She came out with a completely different book. I have the manuscript. It's different. It's as if it's different. It could be from any book. And I'm trying to think with what the later version, a lot of plagiarism. Yeah. But they did together the anthology for lesbians only,
Mm-hmm.
which was good. They made it be the title, so theoretically nobody who was into lesbian should read it, but of course everybody does. But that had really, really good articles in it.
Mm-hmm.
I felt upset that we're not really listed in it, because at that point we weren't like in the inner circle or whatever. So things were printed from Dykes and Gorgons, but not using our names. So it was like, I don't know how to describe it. So I keep being upset because another friend has had a book printed in the last year or two that's getting all over the place, which is really good. But instead of referring to our book, which she again has stuff that is from our book, she refers to my blog and the date is 2017 as opposed to our book 1990 and the earlier work like Dykes and Gorgons being 1973, because if she just prints it as it was 2017, it makes it look like we wrote much more recently than decades ago. So this keeps happening, and I'm not sure why, but I feel like we're being erased in a number of ways. And I know at this point, Rustin isn't even part of any of this. I don't know what's gone on with her. But with Linda's probably like, I don't care anymore. But Linda's politics are the same, and it's very I mean, I want us to be remembered for the work we did. And if anybody reads something similar and the date is later, it'll be known they've plagiarized us, like Jeffreys.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure how much in there. I mean, I have to look at our books. And like I say, go to the pages in our book and say this is what's plagiarized, but it's in there. So it just keeps happening.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, what was I going to say? Hoagland's later, the actual book she came out with that says lesbian ethics, I think it's just nothing in it. It's like, I always say it's like the emperor's new clothes. And I don't want to be unkind, but to say it's lesbian ethics, and she's a philosophy professor, it's like something's missing. So there were a whole bunch of lesbians around that time who were separatists who decided they wanted to be philosophy professors, so they went in that direction to become academics, which to me, philosophy is a corrupt, I don't know what you call it. Like, what does it mean? So they're writing in all this sort of gobbledygook word salad, just weird. I mean, I think the important thing is to make what we write and say as readable and comprehensible as possible. So lesbians who aren't fluent in English can read it. So lesbians who haven't had formal education can read it. So those who are trying to lie and play games can't get away with it. That it's so clear, crystal clear, that everything we say be simple and clear. And then we can go be poetic.
Yeah, so one question I had was more about the historical trajectory of lesbian separatism, like maybe starting in the 70s and going into the 80s and 90s. When was like sort of the peak and the high water mark, and also maybe explain what's the difference between lesbian separatism and some of these, movements for like women's only, like the land, like women would go off and start communities.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, so maybe parse out what exactly distinguishes lesbian separatism from those other things, and how did it sort of change with time and such?
Well, in this community, women only became very, very important. And almost everybody that I knew that was lesbian, and often a lot of head women, were fighting for women only. But if you mention separatism, they want to cut your throat. They were just like, no, I love my son, I love my ex-husband, I love my current husband. I mean, it just was like, separatism was like really, really attacked and trashed as being, I don't know what, exclusionary. And it wasn't. I mean, any oppressed group has the right to be with each other away from the oppressor. It's really necessary to survive and to form a community. But if you mention separatism now, almost nobody knows what it is. Somebody said, oh, you're a neo-separatist. No. They think it means living on the land. I never lived on any land. I mean, they always bring up this sort of communes on the land. It's the only way to be a separatist. No, I've always been in the city. I've always been mostly in Oakland. A little bit in Berkeley. Yeah, that's it. I mean, no land. That takes, I don't know, a number of things, usually money. So I know some did that. I didn't want to do that. Some of the ones I know that did that seem to be nuts at this point. Then that gets into drug use. That's a whole other issue that I think
Mm.
has really made some real problems with damaging brains. And not to criticize all drugs, because I think some are useful, but cannabis is the one I see causing brain damage, and a lot of that was on the lands.
Mm-hmm.
But it's elsewhere too. That's a whole other issue, because I think it's important to talk about, because the assumption is it's wonderful and everybody should do it, especially now that it's becoming more and more legalized.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of, yeah, separatism doesn't have to do with being on land, being rich, any of it. It just means who you decide to have in your life
Mm-hmm.
in terms of choosing to be. And then there's, if you want to be just with other females, that's one form. Being with other lesbians is another form of separatism. And then, maybe having occasional interactions with other people, men,
Mm-hmm.
or women who aren't lesbians can happen. But just in terms of, for me, separatism is who our lives are around and wrapped around, and
Mm-hmm.
what our focus is, and the goal is to protect other females, the earth and the environment, that's all connected. And like one thing that we talked about in our book that was really attacked, and people are really pushing now, they've been pushing it forever, which is to reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, if they want to save the earth, they do not have to do all this crazy stuff they're talking about. Stop reproducing. If they did that 40 plus years ago when it was talked about, everything would be fine now. That would be solved. People would say, you want the death of the human race. If you say people are at 8 billion now, it was 3 billion, I think, when I was growing up, people aren't going to die out. Just stop. Just see what happens. Give it a go.
Mm-hmm.
Get back to hunter-gatherer numbers. And that would help tremendously, because what's happening now is destroying everything.
Mm-hmm.
The air, earth, water. But everybody, almost all, want to reproduce, or a lot of women don't, but they just do it. And that's sort of an issue in the community. One of the women we really love is going to have a baby, and I'm like, one of my friends is very upset about that.
So would you say there was a particular time period where the lesbian separatism was the most popular, or?
It's hard to tell, because when there were the gatherings, they were in Wisconsin. They weren't. We had a gathering here actually in 1983. That was a day-long gathering.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was another one that was in the area that I was excluded from, but went to part of it. And some of the ones who did that and did the exclusion, actually, them are dead now. But that was very weird. But even the one we did, we got really harassed about the one we did in San Francisco, because invariably anti-separatists will come and they'll start baiting and taunting, and like we said, we weren't providing childcare. It's like, why aren't you providing childcare? Well, why should we? It's like, that's a whole other issue. But that was sort of the very het feminist stuff. A lot of stuff came from het feminism, brought right into the lesbian community without thinking. And I think to some extent that's what the trans cult stuff is too. But when it was at its peak, in a way, maybe the gatherings in Wisconsin, and that was the early 90s.
Okay.
Because it was an annual event that happened,
Mm-hmm.
that a lot came, and some came from other countries.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
But so
And
it sounds
that
like
was
the
nice.
Midwest was where a lot of that
There was,
action
and
yeah.
others, do they know about this at all? They don't seem to.
Mm-hmm.
They don't seem to know there was any, that's where so much happened. In the publications, some of the best, like I said, the Lesbian Insider in Minneapolis. But there were other publications, Lesbian Lives, Common Lives from Iowa City. There were a lot of publications, and considering what there is now. So, but I guess it waxes and wanes. To me, it would be like if somebody had the money to have space that they could have events. I think there's a hummingbird. They could have events planned and make it possible for others to come. We could keep having events.
Mm-hmm.
And there'd have to be a way to protect it. So when the men come to attack us, they can't do it. because that's what finally happened with Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it also got exhausting after, what was it, 40 years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of stuff has to do with survival. Like when I was first in the community, lesbians were renting enormous houses or smaller houses, rent rooms for like $50, and you could live there, and that was your home. And then everything's changed, and now you have to be a millionaire or double millionaire to own a house.
Right.
I mean, forget owning. So renting a room somewhere, that's the rooms I see for rent are like double my income.
Mm-hmm.
So that alone changed everything, I think. And
the cost of living problems.
It's worse here, but it's not good other places. Yeah, definitely that. So then they're like, well, then you have to live in the land. I'm not living in my fucking land. Where? What? How? Who? I'm not going to go somewhere I can be, not have a place to live when it's over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a problem with a lot of these women's communities, is that it was just hard to recruit new members and survive. When you get older, then
there's that.
Younger people take care of you, but if there aren't younger people, I mean, it's the same problem with a lot of religious communities too.
That's
actually,
true. Interesting.
Yeah,
because there wasn't that in the beginning, because there weren't that many that were older.
Well, of course, yeah.
So that was like, that wasn't talked about, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Jane Miller was like in her mid-40s, and she was considered old. So that's young now.
Yeah.
So I don't know. But yeah, in terms of survival, I don't know. Then there's that. But resources get taken away. So a lot, their resources will go back into their families instead of lesbians.
Mm-hmm.
Or then there's all that. So even families have been horribly abusive to them. But yeah, but that's a good. Yeah, but I mean, it's possible to have communities where you're not like committed to taking care of each other either. I mean, we do what we have to do to survive. But
well, you can have. I mean, like you were saying, this can happen in a city. You can just have communities of friends, an extended friend network.
Yes,
I think that's a big misunderstanding a lot of people have when they hear like separatism. They think like, well, I literally have to go start a self-sufficient community and we'll grow all of our own food and live off the grid, and it doesn't have to be like that. It could just be it's a social commitment, you could say.
Exactly. I don't know why they think that. I mean, whenever it comes up online, I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I know very few who've done that, and they weren't really separatists, most of them anyway. And I know some real horror stories where some woman is staying there with her son, and somebody brings their daughter, and the little boy rapes the girl, and the girl and her mother are like 3 years old, the girl, and they have to leave because the boy stays there. That's not separatist land. I mean, I have heard some of the most god-awful stories. So, yeah, I mean, to me, one of the scariest things is if you end up somewhere you can't leave. You're trapped. So, nope. Yeah. So that's a myth about separatism. I don't know. I know some said they were separatists who lived on land. Some, I think, they were rich and they had land and they had their city houses too. So that's nice. But yeah. So a lot of myths. That's good to talk about the myths about separatism.
Yeah, I mean that was a misconception I know I had. So.
Oh really?
Yeah. I think when I was thinking like lesbian separate, I mean, obviously I know you weren't living on a commune in the middle of nowhere, but I kind of had that association. So it was good that we made that made that distinction.
That is, the thought of that is scary. I feel like I don't know if it's childhood trauma from hearing how my mother grew up, living in the country, trapped, big in foster homes. I mean, it was just like, to me, that's one of the worst. And I have a friend that got adopted from Europe that was brought to a place not far from Cincinnati that was a Kentucky tobacco town where it would just sound like absolute hell that she was brought there. She didn't even speak English, and she had to learn English, and it's just like everything about it. No, we have to be able to leave, and we have to have cars that work. Yeah, no. for those that had land and there would be events that would happen, that was nice when things would happen. And music festivals continued. Like there was called it Feminist Music Festival here that went on for a few years called Fabulosa that was open to the public, but was mostly lesbian that friends did and I went to. And
was that in the 90s or 80s?
No, recent.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. I think kind of before the lockdown thing, it was still going.
Oh, okay.
To some extent.
All right, so very recent, yeah.
I'd have to look it up, but they were at Walker Creek Ranch for a while. They were first up by Gurnville, Walker Creek Ranch, and then somebody in the community fell out of a bunk bed and sued Walker Creek and lost them that venue, which was the best, because you could just drive. I wouldn't stay overnight anywhere. You could just drive there and drive home. So then they got land and they relocated to a place inland, like near Yosemite, but like 100 in the summer. And I never made it to that place. It's like a 3-hour drive. So that's like one little thing. You lose a venue. They're paying for it, and then their donations, so we help. And that was an almost all women lesbian yearly event that was open to the public.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
With music and all kinds of stuff. It was really, it went on for days. Walker Creek, incredible food. So that was really nice. And the lesbian who did it and her friends now had tried to do the one that was inland, but it didn't continue, partly I think because of the distance and the temperatures and just But yeah, that's all it takes in a way is one person and a few. She owns El Rio. She's wonderful, Dawn. I don't know exactly what's happened with all of it, but she was so nice. I mean, it's just wonderful to be friends with her in that community. And not separatists, but very, very, very lesbian supportive. So,
I mean, I often hear a lot of people talk about the 90s as being a big high watermark for lesbian culture more generally. I don't know if you observed any of that, or.
I'm trying to think, when was that? What happened? I don't know. 90s. Then I go back to who was I lovers with at the time. 97, I lived in England for 6 months with another lover. With New Zealand, I lived 2 months and then 1 month. That was 83 and 84. But what was I doing the rest of the time? I don't know. I think as things became unaffordable, a lot moved out of the area who couldn't afford to live here. That changed things.
Where did they move?
I'm not sure. Some went to Oregon, some went all over the place.
Oh, okay, that's interesting, because I know Oregon, actually Washington too, seems to be like, the Pacific Northwest seems to have this enormous concentration of lesbians. Yeah.
Well, a lot went up to Sonoma County.
Okay.
There was this.
I think I've heard of that too. Yeah.
This cult that I think had 1,000 members. It was in Tennessee. That was mostly, I was told, white middle class people, pets, and a whole bunch of them moved to Sebastopol, that area.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I'm wondering if maybe if affordability seeded some of the
they
northern.
I guess from money and from husbands, ex-husbands, and family, they could buy property there or something. I don't know. I mean, when I see room for rent and I look at it, I was like, well, that's nice. I was like, no, not even close. But you have to, at this point, you have to have a friend who's got a space like Carol does to have a party, like a birthday party where friends can come over and sit and talk or play music. You have to have a big enough space.
And it's interesting too, because now the Pacific Northwest has gotten much more expensive.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a good way to get rid of the lesbian community.
Yeah, it's money.
Just make everything unaffordable. Yeah. I don't know what happened with the people in the East Coast, because there's whole other communities.
Well, last time I checked, one of the few last lesbian bars was in Alabama.
Oh, that's interesting.
All that.
There were lesbian bars here before there was a lesbian feminist movement. There were lots of them. And there were bars that were almost all African American lesbians. There were bars of different kinds. These whole communities, sub-communities. And some of them were really nice.
Uh-huh.
And some say it's because so many lesbians stopped drinking.
Oh, I've heard that, yeah.
But I don't know if that's really the reason.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. Where did they go? I mean, it's like they shouldn't be gone. Of all things, they were the first. They should be the last.
Well, I think in general, a lot of in-person meeting spaces, I think bars have declined in general, maybe.
Okay.
And a lot of bars, too. I mean, going back to the price thing, a lot of bars get pretty posh. You know,
Good point.
And alcohol's expensive, honestly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. And also, it could be that, like, maybe lesbians just felt like they were more integrated within wider society and didn't feel a need to meet. But then that sort of, I think, has come back to haunt us.
I know. I mean,
yeah.
You can turn on TV and it's like, here's the latest police captain, here's the latest fire person, here's all these different, and they're lesbians.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell that this, you know, all these different people in the media were part of the culture, but they're visibly lesbians. Butches, many of them to be visibly lesbians. I mean, you can tell by their voices. I mean, so it's that's interesting. That's nice. But in a way, there were always some like that too.
Mm-hmm.
Like the lesbian, I went to a women-only dojo for 5 years and taught self-defense for 10 years. And it was what we called an old dyke, which meant old dyke was not based on age, but out before the feminist movement, lesbian, butch, who started this dojo and made it be a women-only dojo. And then suddenly it was full of lesbians.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really a good school in terms of learning self-defense, and you had to teach as you were learning. So that was really excellent. And now they go to the gym. And so it's not a community. They're not learning self-defense. And I don't know why anybody does that, but that's what a lot are doing. Mm-hmm. And they're getting injured too. But yeah, so that was a real popular kind of thing for a while. Different dojos.
Oh, interesting.
And it was interesting too, because there were women only, and there were mixed dojos. And lesbians were in both. And the ones where there were injuries were the mixed dojos. And the ones that were safer were the women's dojos. So
interesting.
Yeah, kind of predictable, but yeah. But that's part of our history too. So
yeah.
And BJ just got too old to continue. BJ Millette, who did the dojo we went to, that was in Oakland, actually some of us moved out in that area to be near the dojo, and our friends who lived in that area, because I wouldn't have wanted to live where I live now if it wasn't for that. But we're out there now, a lot of us. So, but it would have been great to continue it some way. But BJ got old, and it was like too much for her. So she sold it to one of her students who had been a separatist, who I'd been friends with. And we actually did a publication together. A group of us did a publication that was anonymous about guns, the women's gun pamphlet, but that's another issue. So, which isn't talked about much now, but should be, especially with those getting attacked and murdered. But anyway, yeah, there was, it's sad that the dojo itself, it went for a while, and then it got sold to somebody else, and it was turned into something else. It was sort of a general women's martial arts. I don't know, it's gone. It's gone now. So,
okay.
Yeah, but BJ had been an old dyke, butch. Yeah. Probably lifelong lesbian out before the movement. So I think there were a lot of those who helped create what we later had as the lesbian feminist community.
But before lesbian feminism, or lesbian separatism, there were just a lot of lesbians who wanted to organize and hang out.
I think so.
Yeah.
And then in the East Coast, I don't know, there was the New York City lesbians, and there was Washington, D.C., where they did the Furies. And that gets into a whole other issue about things that happened that were horrible. But I mean, I know these backstories because I know individuals who are part of things. So that could be for another time. But I guess.
Well, I don't know.
I have no idea what
I think this is a good amount of material for
lot.
now. Yeah, it's actually we covered quite a bit, and I'm sure we could do a lot more. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.